Hello and welcome to the PCJ Media Archives. I'm Keith Parent. Way back more than 20 years ago, before the internet and satellite communications, many international broadcasters like the Voice of America, Radio Netherlands, Deutsche Welle, and others had huge transcription services. They would send out tapes to radio stations around the world to have their programs aired on local AM and FM stations. One station that was notorious for sending out tapes in huge quantities was Radio Moscow. I remember a station that I worked at in the 1980s would not just receive 2 or 3 tapes a week, but up to 10, sometimes 15. They included Moscow Mailbag, Soviet Viewpoint, Soviet Commentary, Science and Technology in the USSR, Jazz Show, and many others. Many of these tapes are floating around today. We now bring you one of those programs, which was a series produced by the transcription service of Radio Moscow. It's called History of the Soviet Union.
At the request of listeners, Radio Moscow has arranged a series of talks on the history of the Soviet Union and the aims and accomplishments of the Socialist Revolution. The history of the Soviet Union began 48 years ago, on November 7th, 1917, when the Socialist Revolution took place. In previous talks, we dealt with the situation on the eve of the revolution, its main aims, and what nationalization has meant for the people. Today's talk is about the Soviet form of government.
Not all of you may know that Soviet is the Russian word for council. Soviet government is government by council. Government from the local bodies right up to parliament, otherwise known as the Supreme Soviet, is administered by Soviets of People's Deputies. In other words, by councils comprised of men and women elected by the people to represent them. The Soviets as they are today originated sometime before the 1917 revolution. They appeared as the result of the unrest that was seething in Russia long before the revolution. The World War had deranged the country's economy. The army had suffered tremendous losses, and the villages had been combed for replacements for the front. There was a severe food shortage. The people were war-weary and rebellious. Peasant uprisings rocked the countryside. National minorities were rebelling. Industrial strikes became an everyday occurrence. And army morale was at 0 point. The soldiers refused to obey their officers and left the front lines in large numbers. Food riots had begun in the cities. Public indignation reached its culmination in early March 1917. 90,000 Petrograd workers downed tools and poured into the streets demanding bread and peace. Prominent among the posters was the slogan, "Down with the autocracy." The strike swelled into a general walkout. Soldiers summoned to put it down refused to fire at the strikers. The workers disarmed the police. By the 12th of March, the soldiers had joined the workers, and the entire city was in revolt. Events had developed so swiftly that the initial strike committees were unable to cope with organizational problems. The workers decided to set up a centralized body, a council. By evening of the same day, workers at many factories and soldiers at some of the Petrograd units had elected representatives to a Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. This council was the embryo of what is now the Soviet government. The Russian communists, who came to power as a result of the 1917 revolution, adopted the Soviets as their form of popular governing bodies. Soviets were set up throughout the country. Thus, since November 1917, national affairs in the USSR have been administered by the people, not nominally, but literally. There is no denying that a country's economic setup determines its way of government. Whoever owns the means of production runs the country. The Soviet Union has public ownership of the means of production, and public administration of government in the full sense of the word. Let us see how it works out in practice by drawing some comparisons with a political system in a society of private enterprise. The success of a candidate's campaign in elections in a capitalist society is decided all too often by how much money he or his sponsors have spent on it. The average working man cannot afford to run for office, nor are there many working men's organizations which can raise sufficient money to put their man in office. In the Soviet Union, campaign expenses are covered out of funds allotted for the purpose by the national budget. Neither the candidate nor his supporters pay anything. The candidate is judged by his merits, not his money. In a society of private enterprise, the working man has no say in nominating a candidate. His electoral right, when he has it, is practically limited to voting on election day. In the Soviet Union, candidates are nominated by the mass of people at places of work or at general membership meetings of public organizations. The nominee is usually a fellow worker or member of the organization holding the meeting. This ensures more genuine direct representation of the people in government than any other system. In Western countries, the platform of a candidate comes to the voters ready-made. They can accept or reject it on election day, and nothing more. In the Soviet Union, a candidate gets his platform from the voters. At voters' meetings during the election campaign, the people tell him what he is to do as their representative in government. The instructions may range from local improvements to foreign policy, and the candidate is pledged to abide by these instructions if elected. Otherwise, he can be recalled, and by-elections will be held. And the procedure is the same for all governing bodies, from the local Soviets to the Supreme Soviets of the republics and the whole country. The Soviet is the highest authority in the administration of all affairs in its area. The range of functions of Soviet governing bodies is much broader than that of governing bodies in Western countries. It would take too long to enumerate all the functions of Soviet government. But just remember that the entire economic setup, industries, agriculture, communications, trade, and all services and utilities for the public, is nationally owned and administered. The banks also belong to society as a whole, as do the schools, theaters, the hospitals and other medical facilities, and health and vacation resorts. In fact, everything on which the public's welfare depends is nationalized. Supreme jurisdiction throughout is vested in the Soviets. The Supreme Soviet, or Parliament, makes the laws, forms the national government, conducts relations with other countries, and has the final say in all domestic and foreign policy. The Supreme Soviet is elected in the same way as the local governing bodies. Its members are nominated and elected by the people, and the people instruct them what to do as their representatives. The composition of the Soviets is also indicative of the far-reaching political rights enjoyed by the citizen here. Soviets in industrial areas are composed largely of industrial workers. In farming areas, mainly of men and women engaged in agriculture. City and regional Soviets and the Supreme Soviets are representative of all sections of the population, all trades and professions. Of the 1,443 members of the National Parliament at present, 781, or more than half, are industrial workers or farmers. Of this number, 646 are workers engaged in production. In other words, every third member of the Soviet Parliament is a producer of the material wealth of the nation. 7% are engaged in cultural pursuits, the arts, literature, and the sciences. This corresponds approximately to the composition of the population of the Soviet Union. Aside from the fact that the people nominate and instruct members, and large numbers of them serve as members themselves, the Soviet system affords the people many other opportunities to participate in government. Many help local governments by acting on some committee as volunteer assistants. In the Russian Federation alone, well over 1 million men and women serve as volunteers on such committees. Public discussion of draft laws also draws tremendous numbers into the administration of national affairs. Soviet citizens have ample opportunity to take part in governing the country, and they are encouraged to do so. A form of government that puts national administration entirely in the hands of the people, combined with public ownership of the means of production, has brought into being genuine democracy in this country.
You've just heard a talk in our series on the history of the Soviet Union, the Socialist Revolution, and its aims and results. You are tuned to Radio Moscow.
If you enjoy these special programs from PCJ Radio, please let us know what you think. Our email address is mnp@pcjmedia.com. That's mnp@pcjmedia.com. Thank you for listening.